I've never met.
Or on the news. But you can find it here with news on the flip side. Remember, don't be politically correct. Just be correct. Join us.
Tune in to UFO Undercover, Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, with your host, Joe Montaldo, right here on the Paranormal Radio Network.
Welcome to another episode of the Dawn of Shades. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and we have our usual announcements to make before we get started tonight. Now, for all of you Facebookers out there, we do have a Facebook group specifically used for this radio program, and it provides an easy way for everyone to make comments or ask questions about the program in general. Now, I don't monitor the page during the program, so it's not a very good way to ask a question. I would suggest going with the email for that. So if you want to ask a question, send it in to giascott@exogenynetwork.com, and we'll get your question asked for you. And for all the other people on Facebook, once again, I also have an author page on Facebook, and I would like to invite everybody to visit it, and you can like it and give me a little bit of support and find out what's up and what's going on. Now, for tonight's program, just like all programs, I would love to have the audience's input with questions and comments. So don't forget, you can email them to me at giascott@exogenynetwork.com. You can also send in questions about previous guests or the show in general, and I will try and get those questions answered for you as well. Now, tonight's program is the second program in our series, Talking Threads, and it will continue through a total of 9 programs featuring indigenous writers who have all been contributors to an anthology called Unraveling the Spreading Cloth of Time. We have 2 of those people joining us tonight. So I'd like to welcome to the program Dean Hutchins and William Yellow Robe. Dean, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay, my name is Dean Hutchins. I'm of Cherokee descent. I was born in New York City, although I presently live in Virginia. I've been writing for quite a while, probably since I was old enough to pick up a pencil. And there's probably a lot more I could say about myself, but if I say too much, you won't read the book when it comes out or see the movie.
Okay, William, we're going to put you on the hot seat now.
Okay. My name is William S. Yellowrobe Jr. I'm an enrolled Assiniboine from the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, where I was born and raised. I'm presently living in New London, Connecticut. I've been a playwright, director, actor, and poet, and lecturer and teacher for a number of years now. I'm also a member, I'm a legal professor at the University of Maine and a faculty affiliate at the Creative Writing Department at the University of Montana. And I just finished a Native Playwriting Festival in Arley, Montana for the Salish and Kootenai tribes. And I've also been working with the American Indian Actors Association in New York, New York.
Okay, you've been busy too. I feel kind of, like I've really been a slacker all my life with you two giving off your qualifications here. When you were asked to contribute to the book Unraveling the Spreading Cloth of Time, I know that in some cases pieces were written for the book, in other cases the pieces were already written. Which is which for you?
Is that to me, Phil, or to Dean?
Either one of you, both of you, actually.
Okay, I'll go first. Dean, or do you want to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay,
this is Dean. When I was first approached to this, I wasn't sure what I was going to put into the book. I had some things that were already written, but I kind of sat down and meditated for a while and decided I needed to create something new for the book that specifically met the theme of the book and where I thought things ought to go. So I actually sat down and wrote something from scratch. I just let it come to me, and it did.
Okay. And William?
Hi, this is William again. I don't know. It's kind of a difficult question to answer because I'm trying to figure out now the chronological order of time here. I was writing on Facebook. I did these things called spam rants. And basically, these are rants about politics and social environment facing Native people on contemporary issues. And what happened was that Mary Jo Moore contacted me and asked me if I would be willing to make a contribution to this book. And I thought it was a great honor because I hadn't even thought about it. And then I was racking my brain, searching, trying to figure out what I would write. And she said, well, why don't you submit the short story that you did on Facebook? And I thought, well, which one? Because by then there were 3 or 4 other short stories I had. And she said, the one that you just did on the 12-12-12. And I said, sure, no problem. So once I submitted it, I thought, well, this is the easiest publishing process I've ever had. And then she suggested an essay to go along with it. So that was a little bit more difficult, trying to find a very brief and concise essay to accompany the story. But I was very honored by the fact that, it was for Vine Deloria Jr., who I'd met several years ago and have always been an admirer of his work. So to get that out there was just a great honor.
Yeah, when I read the 12-12 essay, because I will confess, I read both of you guys' pieces again today before we went on the air, so I didn't totally forget what we were going to be talking about. I thought, oh, yeah, this is so right, because I remember all this hype about the whole 12-12 thing, and, the world was going to come to an end because the Mayans or the Aztecs, I forget which, but somebody from that general, neck of the woods south of the border had said that, that the world was coming to an end and it was on a stone tablet because that's what we were told it said. And I thought, it isn't going to be that easy. I mean, we're not getting off the hook that easy. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And so to see somebody else was kind of like, the same ballpark I'd been along, going on, was kind of cool, because, so much of the time we get all this hype and nonsense that goes nowhere.
Yeah, this is Bill again. The reason why I wrote it was amazing to me that we've had all these great elders and leaders talking about the positive aspects of how to lead a good life and, taking care of the environment. We've had all these wonderful elders and leaders saying all these positive things, but it amazed me that mainstream latched onto this real negative thought and ran with it, and it was promoted to a point where it was just embarrassing.
It was everywhere. I mean, it was really hard last fall to be optimistic. I did, going back to Facebook again, shortly after the, last year started, I had said something about I was going to have a New Year's Day party or New Year's Eve party on 12/31, and that I was going to be there, and I was curious who else was going to be there, because of the fact that I really didn't think the world was going to come to an end. Nothing supported this line of thought, as far as I could see. We weren't going to have any magical transformations. We weren't going to get hit by an asteroid. We weren't going to blow ourselves up. We just weren't going to get off that easy. That's all there was to it.
Yeah, this is Dean again. I just have to say that I loved William's piece in the book. William is a great playwright, but he's also somewhat of a comedian. And his piece really hit the mark on that, because all the Hollywood hype that went around the Mayan predictions were just incredible. And I think they really seized upon it on a way to, sell disaster movies and disaster supplies and everything. And, people really looked at that as an opportunity to make a buck.
Yeah, even when because I did hear later after the end of the world's coming on 12/12, but before 12/12, that's somebody else said, no, that's not what the tablet even says. That's not the way their calendar works. Is that it just indicates the end of that particular calendar cycle? And did the media pick up that part? No.
This is Bill again. A part of that goes back to another interesting aspect, is that America has this tendency when dealing with indigenous people, it's easier for them to believe the lie and the negative aspects of indigenous people. And it's always been easy to betray us through misconceptions, misnomers, lies, and it's easy to accept that. Whereas if we were to really look as to what Native people are about and what we're doing, for a lot of folks it's frightening, because it goes against everything that we're taught to believe or think or feel about Native people. And the whole miracle, the whole 12/12/12 prophecy is part of that legacy of the negativity. They're more willing to believe the negative aspects, that Native people would really want to have the world destroyed. They really like that, but yet at the same time, there have been steps in this world where steps have been taken to destroy the world. So it's kind of ironic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't understand why this persistent negative impression of indigenous people persists, really. And it just doesn't go away. And even when when I look back at history, there wasn't much difference in the actual lifestyle granted there were cultural differences, but, when in terms of their technology and whatnot, there wasn't a great deal of difference between the average European and the average person in New England at the time, along the East Coast. And, other than their clothes, their language, the color of their skin. So why was there this huge gulf, being created between them already from the beginning, and the Native Americans were being made out to be such bad guys, savages?
This is Bill again. In order for them to have their country called America, they either had to assimilate or annihilate the Native people. Because the truth of the situation is this, is that there were already people here.
Right.
Even before Columbus, and they could never admit to that fact. That's the reason why in 1492, that's the poem that was taught in grade school. It was taught to kids. It was a lie. And it was a situation where one Native identity, Native reality was never acknowledged. In fact, I wrote a play called Starkweather. And the woman character reminds a non-Native woman that her daughter has come into her house and asked the question, Mama, is it true that Columbus discovered the Indians, that he was here before us? And that was the concept that was being promoted. But see, it's always easier to have someone to play the villain in your lie or in your mythology of someone that's evil.
Well, we see that, I have to agree with you, because we do see that even in relatively modern history. World War II, Japanese were demonized. The Germans were demonized in both world wars. And, granted, they did some terrible things along the way, but I imagine if you checked our own history, we probably weren't exactly the saints, riding off to battle. But, the deal is that we do demonize our enemies. It's easier to kill a demon than somebody who's just like you.
Well, this is Dean. One of the big things we had with the invasion was basically a huge culture clash, because you had two completely different economic systems coming into play, with one group being the immigrants coming over, thinking that you can take land and divide it up and own it, meeting up with the people who did not believe you could own the land. And so there was a clash there in terms of the fact that when the native people in this hemisphere saw people coming from the other hemisphere, they allowed them to stay. They figured, well, there's land enough for us and for you, so you can stay here, but there was not any idea that we were selling the land and would not be able to use it anymore in the future. It was a matter of sharing. So you had basically one culture built on sharing, meaning another culture based on ownership. And when the people who came over initially found out that if they wanted ownership, they were going to have to drive the native people off the land, they brought more people over and convinced these people that the people who had just welcomed them, taught them how to live there, taught them how to hunt, taught them how to fish, taught them how to grow crops, were now ignorant savages who needed to be driven away.
Yeah. And now, X number of years later, we are the descendants of people and that came here or were here either way, or in many cases, both. And we're left to deal with the aftermath and trying to find a place where both cultures can exist. Do you think that's possible?
Well, this is Bill. I don't think it's just two cultures. It's cultures for indigenous people. There are more than just one group here. We're not homogenized.
Right.
We're only homogenized by this government or this system, but we're many nations. And you have cultures here, just as you do in Europe. But I think the other thing, too, that's really important is that whole thing of coexistence, because if you go back and look at history, many native leaders have made that attempt to live in existence, in a balance, and it's always been disrupted. But, the bottom line is this eventually, is that indigenous people are coming forward now, and what's happening is that the reality is changing, because when American history was written, it denied so many people. And yet the American reality has all this diversity, and it's going to collide with American history. So when American history meets American reality, that's going to be the interesting point.
Do you think it's going to happen?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is Bill again. It has to happen because eventually it's pushing for that. I mean, things that weren't possible are now possible. Things that would never happen back then are happening now. For instance, Native people writing books. Native people publishing their works. Native people owning media networks, institutions, education. You're now seeing indigenous people come forward, which was never heard of. Or if it did happen, it was always very small and sometimes marginalized or hidden. But now it's coming forward as being part of the flow of life here in this country.
I think a huge explosion in the literary market, in terms of publishing books and even film media or audio recordings, has exploded courtesy of technology, the internet, ebook, and so forth and so on. It's made things much where you don't have to print it, you don't have to create copies of it and physically put it in stores. People can find it on the internet and buy it, read it, see it, hear it. It's made it much more available for people to actually get what they have written out, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. People can see it much easier.
Yeah, this is Bill again. Another interesting thing, too, is just indigenous foods have made a comeback. People are now discovering the importance of organic gardening.
Right.
Organic proteins. And this is something that Native people have always known for centuries, and now it's coming into mainstream.
And things like permaculture, kind of goes with it, too, in addition to the heirloom crops. That's something else that's made a huge comeback, is the heirloom crops. As people become more concerned about the issue of GMO versus non-GMO diet and, the related health problems that are becoming, rampant, which are things like allergies, diabetes, cancer, et cetera, a lot of people say it's related to the diet and obesity,
The interesting thing here, this is Dean again, is that a lot of this is what was in the predictions that the old ways would come back. And this is not just from the Mayans. There are a number of Native nations that have had that as a part of their legacy for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we are seeing, a much greater interest in better sustainability, if I don't get a knot in my tongue. Better sustainability, things like urban gardening, all sorts of concepts that even a decade ago, people would have looked at you like you'd lost your mind.
This is Bill again. Yeah, it's very true that many tribes are now moving towards this direction, and it's because of the health of my own reality. 3 years ago, I suffered almost complete heart failure.
Uh-huh.
And when I got out of the hospital, what kept me going was indigenous foods, going back to more organic foods. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I had to do even before I got sick, what happened, I think the biggest step I made was an apology for the abuse of tobacco, because I was a heavy smoker.
Uh-huh.
But see, it's that question of becoming aware of what's around you, and actually your consciousness becoming awake and looking around you and seeing what you have and what's in front of you, because a lot of people don't see that.
Yeah, we sort of start taking things for granted, and that's across all cultures. We take things for granted. We may not appreciate the fact that our lives are not all that bad. It could be far worse. The things that, make life so convenient, from flipping on the light switch to mail being delivered, outside your house. There are things that 100 years ago would have been minor miracles.
Yeah. Well, this is Bill again. I think it even makes it more simplistic, the fact that you have a shelter that you can go to. The fact that you have a place that when it's raining that you can go to. The fact that you have drinkable water. The fact that you have water to bathe, water to cook. The fact you have food to cook. Because now in America we're in a situation where we have a high poverty rate. We have a high homeless rate. And the question is that how do we take care of these people? How do we help?
Yeah, finding answers to all of these social problems, ranging from the homelessness rate to unemployment to crime rates to mental illness and addiction and all the other things that can be contributors to all of the above. These are real issues that we're really not addressing all that well because we tend to kind of sweep it under the carpet, I think. If we don't see it, it doesn't exist, right?
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dean.
Okay. I think, these are issues that people tend to address as issues, but nobody ever really sits back and looks at what causes these issues in the first place. I mean, when you talk about homelessness, when you talk about poverty, some of these issues did not exist until, the last 500 years in this hemisphere. There was no homelessness unless everybody was homeless. There was no hunger unless everybody was hungry because people looked out for one another. But we have this society now where, the basic freedom we have in America is freedom of greed. There is nothing that says one person can't have all the marbles. One person can't have everything. And that person would be viewed as a success, not as a person who destroyed a society where we have a couple of rich people and everybody else is going hungry. I mean, that's part of this culture we're living in. There are other places in the world where this type of culture does not exist. Where people are required to look out for another. And you asked the question earlier about whether or not these cultures could learn to get along together. And I think that's entirely possible, but what it boils down to is just one simple word, and that's respect.
Yeah. People need to respect themselves and their neighbors, and, things can go a lot smoother then. And without that, we're in trouble. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, this is Bill again. One other thing, too, that's really important is that a lot of these things are interrelated. And in looking from an indigenous perspective, all these things are related because they're all relative. And because Native people have taken on that responsibility of having all these relations and being related to a lot of these things, these are things that are all interrelated. And you can't just basically push one off to the side. What Dean said was very true, is that indigenous people throughout the world are now asking, why do we live in this present condition? Why does this present condition exist? And, it's amazing that some of them have come up with answers. Some are still working out solutions. So I don't want to sound like it's bleak or it's a horrible thing, but for some people it can be overwhelming. Because if you live in that condition, if you're living in poverty, you're living without shelter, it is overwhelming because I've been homeless myself in my life, and I know how bad it can be in this country.
Yeah, I mean, when you have the type of culture that we have, literally if you're homeless or, somehow needing something, you do tend to become somewhat invisible. People look through you, they ignore you, they don't see you because if they see you, they might have to react in some way without acknowledgement.
This is Bill again. What I used to say in some of my lectures is that it's ironic that for indigenous people, native tribal people, Indian folks here, is that we're homeless in our own homeland. I find that fascinating because most tribes have been pushed from their original homelands into areas that they never lived. And all of a sudden now they're forced to make a life for themselves. And even that, after they've been pushed into one area, it was taken away and they were pushed again. So basically for a lot of Indian folks here in this country, you are homeless in your own homeland. And it's been very difficult to, it's basically surviving this traumatization. There's a trauma that goes along with it. When you lose your house, you lose your job, there's a trauma. And many people have never really had a chance to deal with that trauma. Because why? They're surviving every day. They try to do their best to survive.
Mm-hmm. This trauma, of forced removal and everything, sometimes I have to wonder, is the trauma inherited along with the color of your eyes? Because it doesn't just magically go away. When a family has been uprooted, had everything taken away, and they're shifted to another place, and then it's done again, this repeated trauma, even if they're finally allowed to settle somewhere and make a life of some kind, that energy of the trauma, isn't it still lurking within, the individual psyches as well as their cultures?
Oh, absolutely. There have been studies on this. There's been scientific research on this. There's a doctor named Joy DeGruy who wrote a book on the effects on slavery on present-day African Americans, and she called that post-traumatic slave syndrome, because trauma does get passed from generation to generation. Indigenous people in this country are suffering from post-traumatic invasion syndrome, being moved from one place to another. And what Bill is talking about is really a very deep subject that I don't think enough research has been done on. But if I can go back to Vine Deloria, who was the inspiration for the anthology, he wrote once about how everything on the planet moved around until it found the right place to be. Seeds were blown around until they found the right environment to be planted in. People moved until they found the right place where they belonged. And so everything was where it belonged until it got picked up and moved somewhere else. And dealing with that is traumatic. You can see the same thing with animals. I mean, if you took polar bears and moved them to the equator or something, that's going to be a traumatic thing for them. That's not where they live.
Yeah, and they may not thrive there either, or be the most polar bearish bear they could be.
Exactly.
They wouldn't do well. And, you do kind of wonder about that. You talk about, the wind blowing you to places that, you never expected. Yeah. It, kind of made me think of moving to the south. I had said I would never live east of the big river. And then I ended up, and I would never live in a city. I ended up in New Orleans, and then now I live in Mississippi, and obviously both are on the east side of the big river. And I never ever in my entire life woke up one morning and said, gee, I want to live in Mississippi, the state that ranks last in almost everything.
So how are you doing in Mississippi?
Pardon?
How are you doing down there in Mississippi?
Not well. It's hot. It's miserable. I don't know how anybody lived here, to be honest, ever. Yeah. I guess I just, I spent most of my life on the desert, and humidity just kind of kills me.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure the Choctaw people would like to have Mississippi back.
Yeah, I'm sure they would. There's only a small group of Choctaw that live in Mississippi now, and that's it. There really isn't much going on. Go ahead.
Another aspect of this, though, that I'd like to bring up is the fact that and this is one of the things I tried to come across with in the book, Unraveling the Spreading Cloth of Time, is the fact that indigenous people in this country were scientists. They were sitting around using powers of observation to understand the environment and how it worked and how best to live within it rather than trying to overcome it. And we viewed everything as a series of interlocking systems where everything worked together. And if you moved one thing here, it changed something there. And that's how the whole universe works. And we could see how that works. And it still works that way today. So when we look at something like homelessness or crime, that happens because something happened to cause it. And we throw the systems out of whack. And, this is what the Dene people, or Hopi people would say, the world's going out of balance. And we have to do things to bring it back into balance.
Yeah, and, do you see modern society being able to do that? Is there going to be yeah, go ahead, Bill.
I don't think it's a question of someone being responsible for the solution. What it comes down to, as I said earlier, a lot of this is interrelated. There was something that was said once that if you take care of the environment, all these other problems would take care of themselves. They would fall into line, fall into place if you took care of the environment. And what's happened now is that there's been such a disregard for the environment. There's been this whole corporate attack of the environment through the oil development and fracking, etc., and it's been devastating to the environment. But what's really at the heart of this is that we have to take care of the environment. Even the nations in South America, our brothers and sisters south of us, have passed laws to protect the environment. It's something that should be considered. And it's amazing to me that not one group will have the solution. It takes many different groups working together for that one action of healing, and that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, it won't do us much good to protect the environment if only one little area on this big blue planet does it. Kind of all got to get on the same ballpark.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Bill again. Yeah, it's amazing that there are so many issues at hand here. But it's always boils down to the issue of taking the action and everybody taking an action of some form, focused in that direction. But it's been a long process because at one point even the tribes themselves have come together. And it's always amazing that people say, well, Native people aren't doing anything about these issues, and a lot of Native tribes are. A lot of Native tribes have programs dealing with health, environment, unemployment. It's amazing how Native communities, I'm always amazed and just renewed when I see the work that Native communities are doing, both on the reservation and in urban areas, to take actions to correct these situations or provide a solution to these situations. It's been phenomenal.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see that so many different and diverse cultures, at least to a degree, have worked together, because mainstream society does lump all of, in the United States, all of the Native Americans are lumped sort of in one, lump of clay. And, each group we got all these lumps of clay, there together. And yet, despite the fact that they're very different in many ways, they seem to, in general, have the same goals, even if they're going about it in slightly different ways. And that's kind of nice to see.
Well, I think the key here is respect for the earth itself. One of the things that some of us believe is that, everything is alive, and therefore everything is entitled to respect that we should be giving another living thing. And even though we have, over 500 different indigenous nations just in North America, we share some common values in that regard, and if we can get other people to share in that regard as well, we might make some progress in that direction.
Yeah. And the key is getting people to all work together. And how do you think that's going to happen?
This is Bill again. I hope it's not through violence. I hope it's not an act of violence, because America has that legacy. When it wants something, or when something's about to change, it goes through this violence, or it has this violent action. Take a look at the civil rights movement. A tremendous amount of violence. Wounded Knee, South Dakota, with AIM. When we start seeing change for Native people, it's always been through an act of violence, and I hope it doesn't pursue that. I hope there's a peaceful way for these things to take place, because, when you look at it, most Native leaders really are well educated, and they really do promote peace. and they really do promote communication. And understanding, as Dean said, respect is not just a catchphrase or a cliche, it's an actual living action. Respect is an actual action that needs to happen. And when that truly happens, then we're going to see change. I've always been told that I am sort of an optimist on that, and I still believe it. I still believe there's a possibility for change. I do believe there's a chance for solutions. And again, it's going to be indigenous people, Indian people, who bring about the change. Because again, it is our homeland that we're on. And again, we will come up with a solution, but at the same time, it's going to take some time. It's going to be hard. But like I say, I'd like to see it done without any actions of violence on either side.
That would be the ideal situation. Go ahead.
I'd like to add to that because, as Bill wrote in his piece, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't read the book Unraveling the Spreading Cloth of Time to, get out there and get a copy of it. But he wrote that we have to laugh more, and I think that's really important. It's really important to be not only to be optimistic, but to maintain a sense of humor.
Laughter is always the grease that gets you over the speed bumps of life. And obviously we've got more than a few facing us right now.
I get to laugh a lot because I'm just outside Washington, D.C., and anytime I want to laugh, all I have to do is pick up the news and read the paper about what's going on in Congress. And that's always good for a few good laughs. But the other thing is that, we have to get people into the mindset that when we do something in this country, we should be thinking about how is it going to benefit the society as a whole as opposed to benefiting somebody just making some money. Because, we're all in the same boat. And we have to have everybody rowing in the same direction if we're going to get anywhere at all.
That's definitely true. And, too often, you look through American history, everything has been focused on the almighty dollar. How can you make money? How can you buy more? People want more. They don't want enough. They want more.
Yeah, this is Bill again. Back to that, it's interesting that you say that because originally, a lot of the northern explorers that came through were looking for the Northwest Passage. They were looking for a route to China to get silks. And then those in the south, the Spaniards, were looking for the same passage so they can get to India and get the silks. And basically, it was that whole concept of they came for God, gold, and glory, but basically gold was the main drive. And here in America, unfortunately, what's happened is that we're substituting capitalism for democracy. People are driven for this whole idea of, as being said, to make profit. But they don't understand that sometimes you work not just for a paycheck, but you work for the betterment of your life and those around you. That's truly an act of kindness or an act of humanity, if you will. When you work for someone that's not you and don't expect to be paid. And people would go, that's crazy talk. Well, it was that way several years ago. Not long ago, people actually would take the time to help another person and not be expected to get paid. But in this time that we're in, where everything is disposable, that if something's broke, you get rid of it, or we're in this period, if you will, also mixed with it, is this narcissism, where I'm amazed how many people will take photographs of themselves, whether they're eating meals or drinking a soda, they have to take a picture of themselves, and it's like, well, why do you have to do that? But again, it's that whole thing of having that availability, the camera to do it. There's a narcissism about it that's just so fascinating. And because the Internet's a great thing, but it's also desocializing a lot of people. They don't really know how to function with other people. And that's an art form we're missing, which is, again, that ability to communicate and to listen.
That's true. For a lot of people, the Internet has become their only social outlet. I tend to be somewhat reclusive, so I know that for me, I I'm more likely to interact with somebody over the internet in my personal life, barring a handful of friends and family that I see regularly. Outside of that, that's it. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that.
It's funny. I'm old enough to have lived through a couple of blackouts in New York City. And one of the more interesting things that happened anytime the power went completely out for a period of time was that people would come out of their houses and start talking to their neighbors. Something they never did on a regular basis. But that's all it takes. You shut down technology for an hour and everybody will be outside and talking to people they've never met before who probably live next door to them. Because we tend to use the technology as a crutch to avoid talking to people.
Yeah, that's true.
We've made it socially acceptable to not be part of a community. To live in a box somewhere and not talk to anybody except the people you want to speak to.
Yeah, we bought this. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
I want to say something on that, Dean, because it's kind of funny. This is kind of embarrassing, but for me, I was dependent on the internet because it's cheaper than the phone. And for me, because of my low income status, it's easier for me to email friends going to the library and getting on the internet and emailing friends. It's cheaper than dialing. And what always amazes me is that sometimes we can't afford to pay our bills, so it gets cut off. Mm-hmm. And I realized I don't get panicked over it because, one, I know that it's something that we can do without. Because one thing I used to do a lot of, and I still do, is I send out cards, I send letters. And see, that's still an art form that I still practice, is that ability to write letters to friends, handwritten letters. And if it's really important, I'll find a way to communicate with someone. But see, even that whole thing of having internet, having these iPhones, it's a sense of luxury. And see, the question has always been, do you really need it? How important is it that you have your iPhone on you 24/7? How important is it that you have internet all the time? Because in our mind, we get that we need this. In reality, we don't. But again, it's that whole thing of convincing your mind to focus and get away from that and find the essential things which you really need to live.
Yeah, this is true. I think we valued contact more before we had the internet. I mean, the fact that you make it real easy to talk to anybody, anywhere, at any time, kind of takes the special out of it.
Well, I'm old enough that I remember not only party lines, but when you made a long-distance call, especially out of state, it was a big deal.
Yep.
I mean, really a big deal.
This is Bill. I mean, for my parents, when I was growing up, to get a phone call from my sisters or brothers who were in boarding school just before Christmas, that was a big deal. To get a long-distance phone call, that was extraordinary on the reservation. And the fact that you even you had a phone in your house was extraordinary. Or you had a relative that had a phone. That was really extraordinary. But again, it goes back to that whole issue of, and I say it again, it's just basically, what's the most important thing that you need as an individual? Because again, we get too far ahead of ourselves in believing that we always have to have luxuries, because if we have the luxuries, it means we have entitlement. And if we have, we have privilege, And if we have privilege, then we have entitlement. And it's not always that way, because even now in this country, I've been amazed that, you have such diversity where you have people who sometimes are on the street, but yet they have an iPhone, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah, that's not exactly a cheap little item to go purchase. You can purchase a laptop computer cheaper than you can buy an iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but again, the service plan going.
Yeah. This is the idea that, it's a luxury that I need to say something about myself. And it's like, do you really need that to say something about yourself? The image of you holding that iPhone create this image that you're normal, that you're acceptable. I mean, these are things that it's amazing that we convince ourselves in our minds that we have to have these things in order to be accepted.
Or that we have to have them to function even, because I think about it, I've lived without electricity. I have had running water in the house, but the toilet wasn't in the house. No electricity, no phone. It was miles and miles to a paved road. And I didn't have a bad life. We had light at night. It was gas light, but we did have light at night. I could read. We didn't have TV, obviously, with no electricity. It was no big deal. And yet today, if I don't have electricity and internet, I think I'm going to die,
There's another aspect to that sense of entitlement also, because in today's society, I mean, if you've got a laptop computer, you've got a phone, you've got internet access, you feel connected to the world. And therefore, you don't know your neighbors because you don't need them for anything. You see a homeless person on the street, you don't need that person. That person is not part of your tribe. Your tribe is the people who are connected. And those are the people you talk to, and those are the people you work with, and those are the people you're concerned about. And anybody who is not hooked up to the network, becomes basically, a throwaway person. We don't need them anymore.
Yeah, this is Bill again. It's interesting that you talk about perceptions, because that's very true, because when I see a homeless person, I always ask myself, do I know them? That's very true. I have to ask that question, do I know them? Because sometimes, I've always wondered, and it actually happened to me a couple of times, I've run into relatives that way. Mm-hmm. But see, it's amazing that, that whole idea that we have to have these luxuries in our lives to have this sense of fulfillment is a falsehood. I mean, that's a real good question that even Brian Deloda asked in his work, that question of, what do you need to feel whole again? What do you need to have that sense of being filled? Because America has always had that problem of not being fulfilled, not having a sense of being full.
Mm-hmm. I think also we have the situation in this country where we constantly thrive. This is going back to the first topic we brought up about demonizing people. So if we're not at a war where we have an enemy to demonize, we turn around and we demonize the poor people. And
yep.
say,
or somebody who's a different color or speaks a different language or has a different accent or, their hair's a different color. We got to find somebody. We're like a bunch of chickens picking on
terrorists.
somebody.
They're either terrorists or they're lazy. They don't want to work. They live off society. You see people on the street. They must be on drugs. That's why they want the money. We tend to take these people and turn them into demons.
This is Bill again. Let me cross the line here again too and say one of the things that's happened, and I think this is also one of the major differences between the native cultures here and the pilgrim cultures that came, was that native people have always honored and respected women. And see, with the coming of Christianity in the Bible, women don't really have a big role to play. But in native spiritualities, women are the forefront of that. They're the forefront of life, of culture, of philosophy, of intelligence. Intelligentsia, all these things. They are a major component of life itself, Mother Earth. But when it comes to mainstream culture, women don't have that role. They're looked upon as second class.
Yeah, I mean, literally, Europeans regarded women as chattel. And that probably would have caused a great deal of issues when they arrived here, and that wasn't true with the native people. Obviously, that would be a huge threat to a patriarchal society.
Well, it caused a conflict, too, in the fact that, they did not want to speak to the women. They wanted to speak to the men. And in cases where the women were in charge, the Europeans would pick some man and tell him, you're now the chief and we're going to talk to you.
Yeah, and it really caused a huge disruption in the flow of traditional societies. And that probably has contributed a great deal over the time to this whole, invaded trauma syndrome that we're still seeing the aftermath of. Mm-hmm. I think about even in my own case, because my family is very definitely matriarchal. My first husband was English, from England, and he found it very threatening. He thought that because of the fact that the way my family worked, that men had no value, that we regarded them as disposable. And he never could understand that it wasn't that. It was just men and women were different. Different areas of influence, or however you wanted to put it. But, they were just different. It wasn't that one was better than the other or one was less valued. It was just a concept he just couldn't understand. And I often see that with people who marry into my family, that they have a difficult time understanding that we don't regard men as weak or useless or disposable, that they just don't get it.
Right. This is Bill again. In my work, in my plays, I usually have strong Native women characters in my work, and the only time where the men really go berserk is when there are no women in presence. They're not in the play. And this is when the men will go insane because they're really, as Dean pointed out, unbalanced. They're very much unbalanced. But it's amazing to me that we were taught to respect our sisters and my mother and my aunties. And I found it fascinating when growing up and watching mainstream kids curse at their mother. Always blew my mind when I saw that. It's like, wow, that would never happen in our house.
What even horrifies me as much, if not even more, is when I see mothers cursing at their children.
Oh yeah,
that's just shocking to me. I can't imagine it.
That happens. I won't justify it. I won't talk on it, but like I say, when I see a male figure attack a mother, that's really sad.
But on this note, guys, we do have to take a break. It's time for our break, so folks, don't go anywhere. Stay tuned, and we will be back with more with our guest tonight as we talk about all sorts of things.
I was thumbing from Montgomery. I had my guitar on my back when a stranger stopped beside me in an antique Cadillac. He was dressed like 1950, half drunk and hollow-eyed. He said, "It's a long walk to Nashville. Would you like to ride?" I sat down in the front seat. He turned on the radio, and them sad old songs coming out of them speakers was solid country gold. Then I noticed the stranger was ghost white pale when he asked me for a light, and I knew there was something strange about this ride.
churchofmavisradio.com for upcoming shows, paranormal news, and show archives. That's www.churchofmavisradio.com.
Doctor, my eyes, tell me what is wrong, was I unwise? To leave them open for so long.
Ever, yes. Ever. The worst car in the world, all things considered, ever, yes.
The Lexus SC 430.
I'm just glad they didn't say Lightning McQueen. On Monday's Top Gear, rather than rip on the regular awful autos, Jeremy Clarkson and company tested out top-end cars, like the under 200 horsepower Toyota Boxer and the Ford GT. But it was the discontinued Lexus SC 430 that won, or lost.
The ride in this thing is absolutely diabolical. This isn't a particularly bad road.
No, and look at us. We're bouncing around all over the place.
Could be because you're going over hills. Just saying. It wasn't just the handling. The drop top also bugged these British buggers.
Well, interestingly, the electric roof takes 25 seconds to fold away, which is about twice as long as it should.
That's convertible baloney. They gotta speed that up.
There's only one word to describe the sort of person who would buy this car: an American.
More specifically, an elderly American. Because this was the last car ever made to be fitted as standard with a cassette player.
Was it really?
What's the matter with a cassette deck? My car is a VCR. I'm Theo Von. Make sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Plus, come back Wednesday for Who Do You Think You Are, featuring Chris O'Donnell. I can't wait to see the look on his face when he finds out his real mother is...
Hi, I'm psychic medium Christopher George, and along with my co-host Victor the Voice Furman, we're Second Sight NYC. Victor, who do we have as a guest this week?
Chris, our guest this week is Stephen Ray Osnich, author of the brand new book, The Great Pain Deception. Faulty medical advice is making us worse.
You know what? My doctor told me if I didn't stop abusing myself, that I'd go blind. Well, I fooled him. I only did it till I needed glasses.
You're the one who makes me come running. You're the sun who makes me shine. When you're around, I'm always laughing.
Tune in to the Mind Cemetery with your hosts Chip and Nicole every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern.
Exclusively on the UFO Paranormal Radio Network. We delve into UFOs, abductions, ghosts, aliens, conspiracies, and cryptozoology.
And how could you ever forget about those creepy topics you won't hear on your local news?
This is where I would insert my obligatory skeptical statement. The Mind Cemetery, where the paranoia about the paranormal comes to rest.
Follow us on Twitter and subscribe to us on Facebook. Also check us out on our website, mindcemetery.com, for show updates and the critically acclaimed Mind Cemetery blog.
It's not critically acclaimed, but you should check it out anyway, mindcemetery.com.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Benetti, and along with Joe Montaldo, we host News on the Flip Side. Come join us every Saturday night at 7 p.m. Central for our 3-hour program. We have opinions on everything, and we're not afraid to share them. False history gets made all day, every day. The truth of the new is never on the news, but you can find it here with News on the Flip Side. Remember, don't be politically correct. Just be correct. Join us.
to UFO Undercover, Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, with your host, Joe Montaldo, right here on the Paranormal Radio Network.
Welcome back to the Dawn of Shades. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and tonight we are talking with two writers, both of whom contributed to the book Unraveling the Spreading Cloth of Time. Tonight's guests are Dean Hutchins and William Yellowrobe. And while we were talking on break, we were talking about Native theater. Bill, you want to tell us a little bit about what Native theater is and what's going on?
Well, what's happened is that when I first started writing, I wrote my first play when I was in sixth grade. That was simply because of the fact I was told I couldn't do it, and I did it. And I got tremendous support from my sixth grade teacher. In fact, when I finally had a meeting with a professional Native theater company in Los Angeles, the Native American Theater Ensemble, headed by Hene Gigama, the sixth grade teacher actually returned the play. She held on to the plays as made copies of them and sent them to me, so I was just amazed. But it's amazing that Native theater with Native people, and I'm talking about Native plays written by Native people, directed by Native people, and acted by Native people. I'm not talking about stories written by non-Natives and then being put on stage. I'm talking about Native people actually doing theater for the sake of their communities. And also, when I first started, there were very few Native playwrights. And as my career started, as I started to journey down this road, I should say, as I started to journey down this road, people would say, well, you're the only Native playwright we know, and along with you and Hene and Thompson Highway. And today that's changed because there's so many new Native playwrights that are out there, like Mary Catherine Nagel, Vicky Ramirez, Julie Kajun, Mark Anthony Rollo, Bruce King. There are so many new, wonderful Native playwrights in this country that are getting their work done, but there's still a lot of work to do because basically a lot of resources aren't there to support their work. In fact, to give you an example of resources not being available, when's the last time you drove down the street and pointed to a theater and said, oh, that's where they do Native theater? Because you can't. The reason why is that there are no architectural structures or buildings that are basically statements of Native theater. So we still have a long way to go yet in making that happen. But the other thing that's happening, too, is that as we train Native playwrights, we are also in the process of training Native actors and Native directors. So it's been a real, really an interesting growth and development process that I've been proud to be a part of.
Well, you're not only, I'm thinking about, the people that are getting trained, you're not only training Native directors and actors, but you're also training Native set designers, Native costume designers. There's a whole bunch of things that come together when people work on theater.
Yeah, this is Bill again. Yeah, there's a tremendous growth because within Native theater, you could actually do plays that support the Native languages, the Native philosophies, the Native religion, the Native spoken word, the stories, the cultures. There's a lot Native theater can do for communities, and again, it's a wealth. And the best thing about it is that it doesn't take a tremendous amount of money. I mean, if you were to do an independent film today, it'll cost you at least a couple million in trying to get the independent film done. But today, with Native theater, you can do it for about maybe $200. and it involves the community. So you have community enrichment and you have a community empowerment. But it really does take a community for Native theater to really evolve to happen. And if everybody's focused on doing something good for the community, then you have a tremendous chance of succeeding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking about it, I now live in a town that does have a community theater, but I think it's probably been 30 years or better since I've even seen a play. And, there's a lot of communities. Theater isn't something that's done. I mean, yeah, your high school and junior high will be doing plays, and you may go see one there. And maybe your community college if you have one, or university if you have one. But actual community theaters are about as scarce as hen's teeth anymore.
Actually, that's not true in not a lot of areas, because I was just in Montana. And on the western half of Montana in the summer, there are about 17 theater companies that start. They do productions also along from June till September. And then they have touring groups that tour the state itself, along with the high school and community productions. So there's a lot of theater going on. In fact, the mayor of Chicago 3 years ago declared theater as part of the mainstream of Chicago as far as the tourist industry. So if you come to Chicago also, you'll see some great theater in Chicago, because theater in Chicago has a tremendous reputation as far as producing professional work.
That can very well be. I have to admit, I tend to be a small town, rural sort of person, and in your small towns and in your rural areas, I lived most of my life in areas that we didn't even have a movie theater. So I guess it's probably not surprising that I haven't seen that many plays in the last few decades. It used to be that every town had a theater where they did not only movies, but plays were often given in the same theater.
Yeah, it's ironic that, Native people were never allowed that access. And now Native people are presenting plays in the community halls, high schools, outdoors. I mean, the theater company I worked with this summer in this Native Playwriting Festival, Kukusam, which means sharing in the Sarus language. They performed last year at the Powwow Grounds in Arlene, Montana, and this year they were in a small art gallery, and they had a tremendous turnout for an entire week. They did 5 new plays, and every night they had a full house. It was a tremendous response, but it was in a community that was probably less than 2,000. And it's on a reservation. So, like I say, it's being done. And
well, I'm glad to hear that it is growing, because I think it is something, when you have creative expression within a culture, I think it helps it thrive.
Well, I think the other thing, too, when that expression has been denied for so many years, it's bound to come out. It's bound to happen. I mean, it's like, to give you an example, everybody praises Western literature, but had it not been for the suppression of Native literature, Western literature would not exist. Because with Native literature, you get the idea of the actual names for mountains, streams, etc., whereas in Western literature, they try to rename a stream. They don't know what to call the stream or why the stream exists. But with Native communities, they tell you exactly the history of that stream and why that stream is important.
Mm-hmm.
And with Native theater, it's interesting, too, because we're looking at, again, the whole process of bringing communities together. And sometimes in Native theater, we ask the questions that people are shy to ask. I mean, one of the biggest compliments that we've received in the past has always been, thank you for saying the words that we wanted to say. So again, we basically adopted the same principles as to Native dancing, which is basically we're doing a play, we're acting, we're speaking on stage for people who don't have that opportunity or can't.
This is Dean. I'd like to just toss in a comment here, in that I have always found that entertainment has always been the most effective means of education. You learn a lot more sitting watching a play than you do sitting in school reading a book.
And a lot of times, entertaining is one way to deliver a message without causing such an angry rejection of the message.
Yeah, this is Bill. The reason why I did native theater, I've been published as a short story writer and a poet, but the reason why I've been fortunate enough to be in theater is because theater for me is the most peaceful form of bringing about change without any bloodshed.
Mm-hmm.
It has that potential of bringing about change. And as far as the value of it, when you're in high school and you go to college, more often than not, you're required to read at least some type of Shakespeare play, some sort of Shakespeare play as part of your requirement.
I have to admit, it was probably my least favorite thing in high school. I never could. This was probably going to horrify you, but I just didn't really regard Shakespeare as all that and a bag of chips.
I'm going to agree
with
you.
For me, this is Bill. For me, it's always been amazing to me that when I had to read literature, it was always these dead white guys. And it's amazing to me that I never really had a chance to experience literature from other people until my senior year actually my freshman year, I started to read outside of the class. I started reading Alex Haley and James Baldwin and started reading these other writers and found a whole different venue, a whole different mindset, along with having to read Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth.
I think I only was inflicted with portions of each of the plays, and I'm thankful for that. Just like a lot of, the so-called classical literature pieces, I found to be tedious and boring and not very interesting. But I'm hardly, I guess, the literary person I should be, even maybe, because some things I just really, people tell me they're wonderful and I read them and I'm so disappointed. And that's for one reason, that's why there's so many different writers out there, because everybody's tastes are a little bit different. In terms of, theater and that's something that can happen in the individual community. But as far as reaching a mainstream audience with the same identical vision, you might say, movies, films, that's the way people usually see something else. Is there anybody out there that makes documentaries that are actually done by natives?
Well, this is Bill again. That happens quite a bit. There's a lot from the First Nations in Canada. There's a lot coming from South America. But the question is, if you're going to try to go to that appetite of just pleasing mainstream, then you've already lost. I've met a lot of native directors in film who are basically doing work that's important to them and not worried about getting into mainstream. There's some really good short feature films that are out there.
Well, I guess in the way I look at it, too, is that understanding comes with acceptance. And in order for people to get along, they really need to at least have some understanding of other cultures. And by understanding them, they become familiar, and it's not something that can be so easily demonized. So if people don't understand native cultures, it's real easy to demonize them.
Yeah, this is Dean again. I'm in agreement on a lot of this because, the media is an extension of the culture. If somebody wants to understand native cultures, then they really need to see native films, see native plays, read native writers, and get an understanding. But like Bill was saying, it's difficult to get into the mainstream. I've done documentaries. I spent about 4 or 5 years doing television programs for a cable access network, but to get those kind of programs into mainstream media is very difficult because the mainstream media looks at it and says, oh, this is just for a small niche audience and only native people are going to be interested in what you're talking about here.
Well, see, that's one thing with the change in the way media is being delivered, because just like books, there's now independent publishing. There's on-demand access to films and stuff that you don't see in mainstream television channels because of the fact that these niche audiences now are worth cultivating because of delivery being so much easier and less expensive.
This is Bill. That's a misconception. That's really a misconception. That's not true at all. It's really hard for directors, even like as Dean said for himself, to get into the doors. I myself have been at Sundance, and it's really hard to get access to these resources in order to do a film. I mean, even Sherman Alexie, when he did a lot of his work, he had to beg, borrow, and steal to do it. I mean, African-American directors like Spike Lee have had to do their own raising of their own film on money to get films done. I mean, they almost went broke doing the movie Malcolm X, which you wouldn't think would be difficult to do, but it was really hard. But for Native people, again, it's that whole thing of the mainstream wants us to do films, but they want us to do the images and misconceptions that they love so much. I mean, it's very rare that mainstream films do movies about contemporary Native people.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I mean, it's easy to get stuff out there if you're not concerned with making a living. I did a short a couple of years ago. It's sitting out there on YouTube for free. Basically, just because I wanted to get it out there. You know, if I wanted to publish stuff and put it out there on the internet for free, I can do that. You know, I'll be living on the street somewhere, but I could be putting stuff out there.
Well, this is very, very true. And even when it's for free, getting people to actually look at it may not be that easy because there's billions of for free things out there. I've read a lot of them, seen a lot of them. And, you know, trying to get people to value them is sometimes difficult.
Well, this is Bill. It goes back to what Louis B. Mayer said of MGM, Mayer Film Institute, back in the 50s, which is, he said, if you want to send a message, go to Western Union. You want to do movies and come to Hollywood. And that's been the status since. And it's hard to get around that because, you know, there's money if you play the stereotype, but when you want to tell an original story, there's no money for it, and that's the way it's always been. But as far as that value of art, it's interesting that America still has that problem of putting a monetary value on art. And they think the monetary value means that the art has tremendous value if it costs this much. And it's not necessarily true.
No, it's all about this perceived value thing. And, you know, it's interesting that there is a huge difference in what you might say perceived value is and actual value. I mean, you know, there again, how many times has any of us picked up a book that's on the bestsellers list? It's supposedly made millions of dollars. And you read it and you go, what a hunk of junk this was. You know, I wasted hours reading this, and it never got any better. Or we saw a movie that we thought the same thing of.
That's what actually made me become a writer. I was picking stuff up and reading and saying, this is terrible. I write better stuff than this.
This is Bill again. There's a scene in the play I wrote called Thieves where a guy is selling things at a vendor's booth during a powwow, and he dyes eggs. He dyes and colors these eggs, these hard-boiled eggs, and he puts an extreme amount, a heavy price on each egg, and he sells them because people think they're sacred and they mean something, so they buy it. So it's that falsehood of, yeah, it's expensive, it's supposed to mean something, and I'll buy it. And he sells out all his eggs. His hard-boiled eggs, I should say.
Or the pet rock. You guys remember the pet rocks?
Sure.
A couple of goo-goo eyes glued to a rock. I mean, go figure. And people bought the heck out of them. Or, even I think back, several years ago, my daughter and I met at Roswell for their UFO festival. And, we're walking around. She sees a number of people wearing tinfoil hats. And, she truly had a blonde moment. She looks at me and she says, Mom, where do we buy a tinfoil hat? I just looked at her and I thought, my God, I raised her to adulthood. She still asks me a question like that. I said, you buy a roll of tinfoil and you make yourself a hat. Sometimes apparently we don't think, because I know she's smarter than that.
This is Bill. Well, that's the thing about native theater is that, it's not just a tinfoil hat or putting googly eyes on a rock. There are some very valid statements that come out of native theater. And it's so sad that for some nations, they waited for so long. So many writers, so many community members have been waiting for so long to say these words, and they're now getting a chance. And basically, native theater is a great approach because it doesn't have those economic, basically, restrictions that you do in film.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important, too, in native theater in that it's undoing a lot of the damage that has been done by Hollywood.
Yes.
In terms of its portrayal of native people.
Right.
I mean, I've done some acting here and there, and I've gone out for auditions where they looked at me and said, you don't look like an Indian.
There you go.
We're looking for somebody, tall, noble, and stoic, looks something like, Michael and Sarah. Or maybe Dustin Hoffman, or...
Actually, there's a scene in a play I did called Better than Indians where they're doing an Indian game show called Hey, You an Indian, where the contestants have to identify several photographs as to whether or not they're native.
Yeah, that could be interesting.
Oh, that is. But the bottom line comes down to this whole issue, too, of owning that perception. See, in native theater, what we're talking about is giving that thought, that perception back to the people. Whereas in Hollywood, it's the studio that controls that perception. The studio controls what you're going to do.
Trying to give my kids an accurate representation of what native is, Hollywood didn't help much. And the images that were portrayed usually weren't particularly positive.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is, too, is there is no single image. Inuits do not look like Navajos, who do not look like Cherokees, who do not look like Micmacs, who do not look like Lakotas.
Right.
But Rita Moreno looks good dressed up as a native woman. I saw a CBS Sunday show with Rita. This is Bill. I saw the CBS Sunday morning show, and they were honoring Rita Moreno, and she actually played a native woman.
Mm-hmm.
But because she was Puerto Rican, they cast her in all these different ethnic roles. I mean, she played everything from the king and I, from native woman, and basically she fit all the stereotypes that was in the 50s. But back to your comment, see, it wasn't about education. It was about selling a thought, which was basically Indians are bad in the 50s and 60s. But see, there's so many great books about native films, films through a native perspective that are out there now that didn't exist. And so there is change happening. But it's always that issue of if you really want to know what native people are like, then go talk with native people.
Well, I guess, that's also the problem, because I know from talking to people, a lot of times they knew native people, but they didn't know they were native people.
Right.
They didn't realize that, that they were. They didn't, or, maybe they live, because there are areas where there isn't an indigenous population that's been left behind. So there may not be a group anywhere, and it's not like, there's a visitor center for each tribe. And this is, they teach anybody things. Yeah, a few of them do have a museum or something where they do education to people who are interested. But for most people, they're never going to have access to something like that. And they just simply don't realize that Native people are often live in their own neighborhoods, or they may work with them, or they may see them at a PTA meeting or wherever.
This is Bill again.
I like the Hollywood ones,
Well, that's what I'm saying. I understand the reality of that. That's the whole thing, is that, Native people aren't always in a museum or can be found in a museum. There is such a thing as a Native American reality out there, and it's really surprising because it goes against a lot of the misconceptions people believe as to how Native people are supposed to, if you will, look, talk, dress, behave. I mean, Native people have evolved in this country, and so it's just not just a look that determines a Native person. And that's the biggest element of this Native American Indian reality that mainstream hasn't really understood. We're more than just bows and feathers. We're more than just people who dance around. That, heaven forbid, Native people actually think and are thinkers. As Dean said, Native people are intellects.
Yeah, it's an extremely diverse people. They don't look alike. A lot of times they have intermarried with people of European descent or of African descent, and so they may physically resemble, some other ethnic group, or people may think that they're Italian or Greek or whatever, or Puerto Rican and Japanese, Chinese, Korean, whatever, and, they simply don't. It's not like Native Americans go around wearing, the Star of David on their arm, a la Nazi Germany, because it didn't like that. And
but let's back up. But at the same time, there were programs that said that you had to have papers if you were going to be a Native person. And then also, there were other requirements that you had to have in order to be accepted as a Native person. But see, all these were from outside forces saying, in order to be Native, you have to have these things. You have to do these things. And it's amazing that's part of our legacy.
If you're filling out the bid on a job application, they ask you for your race. You can check all the boxes. The only one that asks for proof is if you check Native American. Certain government agencies will then want your tribal ID number. Well, if you check black, they don't ask for your African American ancestry number. Or if you check European, you don't have to prove that's what you are. Or if you're Hispanic, you don't have to prove that. So why the Native American has got to produce papers?
Dear, this is Bill again. I think part of the problem with that is that because I encountered that up here on the East Coast, is that they can't believe that Indian people are still alive in some of these communities because they were devastated. I mean, we always talk about what happened in Nazi Germany with the Holocaust, but there have been Holocausts here on this land regarding indigenous people. So people are so amazed that, oh, really, we had Native people here? It's like there were Native people throughout this country, but again, a lot of them were wiped out. Some of them moved by force, whether it be economic, military, resources, they were forced to move. But see, even to hear that a Native person is alive, Chris Rock used to do this routine as part of his routine in the early 80s about one thing you never see is two Native people talking to each other. He saw it for the first time in his life, and it blew his mind because He said, in this country, it's something you never see in this day and age. And, you know, even you yourself said that, you know, you have an audience here who hasn't really seen or heard of a Native person. That's part of the reality, because in some of these instances, we weren't supposed to be alive, but, you know, we shall remain. We're here. I'm sorry, Dean, go ahead.
I want to add something to that, in that we had a couple of different experiences here, too. There were those people who were taken off to reservations, and then there were those who escaped being taken off to reservations. And for those who escaped, being Native in appearance was not a good thing. And this goes back like a couple of generations, back to like the 1920s, 1930s. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, for example, they decided they did not want to have any more Native people in the state. And they did what we call statistical extermination. They basically just started changing records to make people who were Native become colored. Yeah. And anybody who was Native at the time was deathly afraid to raise up their hand and say they were Native, because if they identified them as Native, they would be shipped off somewhere to live on some reservation, and they didn't care what reservation they sent you to. It was not necessarily a reservation where your ancestors were. They just wanted to get you out of the state.
Right.
Right.
And so Native people learned to assimilate and to fit in.
In addition,
in New York,
I got a shock when I moved to the South, and I would, you know, go tour historic houses and whatnot. And so I visited some antebellum plantations. I never realized that Native Americans had been slaves. I also did not realize that a black slave had more rights and was more valued than an Indian slave. You know, you couldn't do certain things to a black slave. It was against the law. Not to say that it never happened, but you weren't supposed to do those things. But those same rights were not extended to Indian slaves. They were better off to be black.
This is Bill again. I want to comment just a little bit on Dean. Then I want to talk about that, which you just brought up, Dean, which is kind of fascinating, because one other form of this disappearance of Native people were the stolen children. Those people that were, those kids that were stolen through adoption, that were, their identity was completely rubbed out. And now we have this whole generation, as Trace DeMeyer has these lost sparrows. They need to come back into the circle of the tribes. So we have a whole generation of kids that have been stolen. There were several generations of kids that were stolen. And then back to the issue of slavery, it's not a question of who did what, because you have to remember, too, to add to that, Cherokees owned slaves.
Right.
There were some tribes that owned slaves, and it's really a mismatch, because that's part of the oppression. You put one group against another.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the legacy of that, too. You put one group against another. So in order for the civilized tribes to really be civilized by the Americans, they had to own slaves. But when they found out some slaves were finding freedom with the Native people, that's also the reason why you had the Trail of Tears, because those slave owners wanted their slaves back from the Native people who held them. Not held them, but I should say adopted them. Mm-hmm. So again, it's really a contrast in reality, especially when you talk about race.
Yeah, you know, the whole the slavery thing, you know, it seems so alien to us today.
No,
this
it's
idea.
Not.
But at the same time, when you look at how society is chained to, you know, this corporate capitalism sort of syndrome, it's not that much different.
Well, it's not even that. This is Bill again. It's not even that. I mean, when you want to talk about the Civil War and you don't talk about slavery, there's something wrong about the conversation. Because how can you not talk about the Civil War and exclude slavery? And yet a lot of people do that.
Well, there are things I think that people find are difficult to talk about, and they'd much rather think the Civil War was about something else.
Right. Which it wasn't. But industry. Sorry, Dee.
Well, the whole thing is that all of these things have created the society that we are today. Good, bad, and indifferent. All these things have contributed to its development. Like the experiences of a child contribute to its adulthood. These were things that are part of our, collective childhood as a nation. And to try and bring it all together now in an adulthood that's, well-adjusted and functional is sort of our job.
Yeah, and it gets back to trauma. This is kind of what you had been talking about earlier because, we have like two really big severe traumas that have to be dealt with in this country, and they are things people don't want to talk about, and one of them is slavery, and the other one is the fact that, it comes down to the issue of land, which is what it always comes down to with Native people, and the fact that the land was stolen. People like to say it was purchased and it was bought and it was given, but when it comes down to it, it was stolen. And it's an issue nobody likes to talk about. And this is why, to a great extent, it's much easier for people to look at Native people and say, well, people are extinct, particularly on the East Coast. I mean, I grew up in New York, and I can remember being in the second grade and my second grade teacher asking me what my ethnic background was, and when I told her what it was, she told me I was mistaken because there were no more Indians. And she didn't tell me that out of any malice or anything. She told me that because that's what she had been taught.
Well, it's a good thing that Native Americans have not gone the way of the dodo bird.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, even at that time, in New York City, there were over 100,000 Native Americans living in the city. Just nobody knows.
It's true.
Yes, so often, people will look at a person of Native American descent and think they're, like I said, they're Italian, they're French, they're Greek, they're whatever. But the last one that come up with...
There's not a single Native person I know who's not been mistaken at one point in time for something else.
Yeah. Because people don't realize that if you're born Native American, you aren't born with a feather in your hair?
Well, no, let's go back. Gia, this is Bill. Let's go back. It's not a question of the person being at fault. The person who's making that assumption about needing the feather in the hair, it's their perception that's wrong. See, that's what's really the problem here. We have this false identity that's been used for so many centuries that Native people have taught to the belief that it's their fault, and it's not their fault. The fault is that they grew up to be human beings. Unfortunately, mainstream America held on to those misconceptions. They held on to those beliefs that were inaccurate. So Native people have had to work their way through those misconceptions. And that whole belief, as being said, this one tribe might do this, doesn't necessarily mean the other tribe does this. Not all Native people own casinos. But yet that's one of the biggest misconceptions that are out there. All Native people have had problems with alcohol. Not true. There are a lot of Native people who've never had problems with alcohol. But again, it's a stereotype that people want to buy and they believe in. But for a Native person, especially this summer, we had a chance to work with a lot of young kids. They're fighting through so much of these misconceptions and false identities. It's overwhelming to them to believe who and what they are. I mean, it's very difficult because when you say you're Native, automatically people go through this list of, oh, you don't have the hair, oh, you don't have the nose, oh, you don't have the skin color, oh, you don't have the eye color, oh, you don't sound like an Indian. oh, you don't dress like an Indian. See, and it's not that individual's fault. That individual has the right to be themselves. But they have all these misconceptions forced upon them that it's hard for them to be themselves. Do you understand?
Oh, yeah. No, I wasn't trying to say that it was, the Native Americans' fault. It's the kind of a collective perception of what being Native American is supposed to be from mainstream. It's been presented by history books that we all know are not particularly accurate, has never been known for accuracy anywhere. It's always written by the victor. All of these things come together to create these inaccurate perceptions.
This is Bill again, dear. I was lecturing one time in a classroom, and at the end of the class, a young student came up to me and said, Mr. Yolob, you don't sound like an Indian. And I thought, wow, you sound like a jerk. But it's amazing that that person had assumed that I would sound this way in their mind, even though I had talked for an hour. They sat there through the entire lecture taking notes and still assumed that I had to sound this way in order for me to fit their identity, to fit their perception, to fit their
belief. Like assuming that somebody's going to sound like a pilgrim. I haven't heard very many pilgrims talk, though, come to think of it.
Well, no, see, we don't have those beliefs because we don't have the luxury of practicing racism. We don't have the means to be racist. We don't own any of the institutions. We don't control any of the institutions. We don't control any of the resources, so we don't have that luxury of practicing racism.
Now, I did have a question from the audience that I got in, and that question is, what kind of feedback have you received from being a part of the collection, this anthology book, and have you received any feedback from the readership? And how welcome are both, this is a long question, and how welcome are both Native and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American reactions to their parts in this book?
I'd like to address that. I'd welcome any feedback from anybody who reads it. I encourage everybody to read it because there's a lot of wisdom in there that applies to the human race. It applies to everything. It applies to the environment. It's, everything is related, and we're trying to get people to understand those relationships and how they fit into it, because we all fit into it. So if anybody would like to read the book and contact any of us, I'm sure we would all welcome it.
And Bill, you were saying something?
Yeah, this is Bill. I agree with Dean. If people are reading it, I say go for it. It's a book meant for all people. I know that there's no sign stamped on the book saying Indians only, so I would encourage everybody to go out and take a look at it and check it out at your library, read it. I think you'll enjoy it. There's a lot of information in there, and please feel free to respond.
I thought it was a very well put together book, and even though so many people contributed to the book and their pieces were very, very different, it's been put together in a manner that it flows in a coherent manner. It's a nice, smooth flow. Unlike a lot of anthologies, it's not like you're playing leapfrog from one idea to another. It seems to go quite smoothly. Now, we are getting towards the end of the program. So do either one of you guys have a website?
No.
No?
Bill, no, I don't.
And how about you, Dean?
I don't have a website per se, but I'm all over the internet. All you have to do is Google me. I've got a blog site out there called Black Buffalo Views at blogspot.com. Okay. I've got a short film up on YouTube. I've got a poetry book that's available through Barnes & Noble. If anybody wants to give me feedback on the book, you can find me on the internet.
Okay. Now, Bill, I know you've got other materials besides your plays out there too. Or if somebody's looking for your plays, where would they find them? Get in touch with you? How would they do it?
They can. This is Bill. They can go to Amazon.com. I have a book with a collection of full-length plays by UCLA Press, a collection of one-act plays from University of Oklahoma Press, and then, just like Dean said, you can Google me on the internet. There's a friend of mine, a colleague, Siobhan Senior from the University of New Hampshire, who put up a Wikipedia website for me, which I never used, but I can be easily found through Google, and I'm always doing something on the East Coast, and sometimes as far west as Montana. So I just look at your newspapers. I might be in your community one of these days, if you're really unlucky. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, the world is getting a smaller place, and we hear that all the time, and hopefully we're going to see more Native theater, more Native writers, a total growth of a whole nother niche in the literary world as well. Are either one of you involved in any projects at this point in time?
This is
I'm
Bill.
involved in a whole bunch. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, this is Bill. I'm doing an adaptation of Power Highways, the book by David Fields. I'm doing it for the American Indian Arts Association. And also I'm writing a new full-length play for the University of Massachusetts, University of Maine, that I hope to be doing a reading of in Bangor, Maine in October. So, yeah, there's a lot going on.
Okay. And, Dean, you were saying?
I've got a lot of projects going on right now. I'm writing a lot of fiction at the moment. Getting it out there is proving to be challenging. And I've got another short film I'm putting together, but it'll be out there on the web somewhere.
Okay, all right. Well, folks, both Dean and Bill have contributed to a book we've been talking about a little bit tonight, as well as their other projects. It's called Unraveling the Spreading Cloth of Time, Indigenous Thoughts Concerning the Universe. You can get it at Amazon. You might be able to get it at your local bookstore. If your library doesn't have it, you can ask them to get it. And I highly recommend it. It is an interesting book. It is worth reading. And hunt it up. It's available both ebook and printed form, and it's a pretty good book to read. So you guys, do you have a last thought? We have maybe about 30 seconds apiece for you to each give one. Dean, you want to go ahead first?
I just would encourage people to read the book, and it's one of those books that makes you think, and we're hoping this will start a conversation. And when we talked about some of the things that were going on that need to change, a lot of us were hoping that this book would help to spark that. And so we'd love to have a conversation with the people who read it.
Okay, and Bill?
I want to thank the community that supported my work and also my families who supported my work. I want to thank all those who donated time and effort to the Native Theater projects, and this would not happen without you. And it's been an honor to be working with the community. I want to thank Mary Jo Moore for giving me the opportunity to share my story, and also the work of Tracy DeMeyer. And I wish both those women lots of, I send my prayers to them and thank them over and over again for all their kindness and wonderful work.
Okay, thank you. Folks, I hope that tonight's program has brought everyone plenty of food for thought, as well as more illumination on your own personal journey towards truth. Tune in again next week as we continue our series called Talking Threads, featuring authors who have contributed to the book Unraveling the Spreading Cloth of Time. So, with all of that to tease and tantalize you, I bid you all farewell. You've been listening to the Dawn of Shades, and I'm your host, Gia Scott, and good night.
treated like the presidential. Motorcade taking up the residential. Global perspiration, biggie gyration, close to fornication. Numbers get passed with